and the disciples and Jesus walking out of the temple, the disciples turn to Jesus and say, "Teacher, what large stones, what a large building this is." Now, the writer of the Gospel of Mark is not kind to the disciples. In fact, he treats them pretty much as if they are naive idiots. The entire time they are walking with Jesus through the Gospel of Mark, from the time that he calls them to be his disciples to the very, very end of the Gospel, they never seem to realize that the person that they're walking with, even though he has done miracles and healings, even though he has provided all of this wonderful teachings and an example on how to live their life, even though he has been a man of integrity and indeed a man of prophecy, they have no idea that they're walking next to the Christ, next to the Messiah. They are clueless. And so when they walk out of the temple and they see the large stones and the large buildings, they are actually providing what is probably for them the most authentic affirmation of faith in the gospel. Because even though they're walking next to the Messiah, throughout the gospel, they do not put their faith in him. What they do is they put their faith in the institution of the temple. And they have no idea. They could not imagine a time in which this building, with such large stones, could ever not be there. One of my favorite things growing up in Europe was the fact that my parents would often take me to the ruins of castles and churches. Indeed, when I lived in Germany, my Boy Scout troop used to take this really short hike up to this little castle on top of a hill that overlooked a small river. It was so picturesque and romantic. And I always had this amazing idea as an 8, 9, 10-year-old little boy that it would just be so cool to be a knight living in this castle. But I had no idea at 8, 9, 10, 11 years old that they didn't have running water or sanitation, and that in the courtyard of this castle would live the horses and the cows and the pigs and the chickens alongside the knight and his bride and their servants and all the other people that lived in this castle, and just how excruciating, disgusting that would be to live in that castle. But the people who lived in that castle, and indeed the people who went to those churches that my parents took me to that were now in ruins, the people who actually lived there and worshiped there, probably never imagined a time that that castle would not stand, that church would no longer be in use. They were going to be there for perpetuity. They had no idea. They could never imagine of a time that it would exist where that castle would just be in ruins, that the church would be nothing more than a foundation. But given a long enough timeline, even the greatest of stones will be turned to dust. Mark, the Gospel of Mark, is being written sometime around the year 65 to 75 CE, about 30 to 35 years after the death and resurrection of Christ. And even though in the narrative the disciples are proclaiming what large stones that they're looking at when they're sitting across the Mount of Olives looking at the temple, the original readers of the Gospel of Mark know a very different reality. The people reading the Gospel know and have experienced Rome marching on Jerusalem. The people reading the Gospel in 70, 75 CE know that the temple and those large stones have been demolished. The temple is no more. Even the largest stones of the temple, the second temple of Herod in Jerusalem, could not overcome the power of the military might of Rome. So scholars are somewhat mixed on whether Jesus actually said these words or said those words in that context, or if Mark, as the writer, is just providing some words of comfort to those reading the original gospel. But to tell you the truth, it doesn't matter. Because what does matter is in the narrative, the disciples are putting their faith in the institution of the temple. What matters is that Jesus recognizes putting your faith in an institution is folly. And so Jesus directs them to put their faith into something that cannot be turned to dust. Because Jesus knows that given a long enough timeline, these large stones, this large building will be turned to dust, and they should put their faith instead in someone who can take dust and create something beautiful and wonderful and life-giving out of it. What Jesus understands is that in the bleakest of moments, you do not look to the institution for answers. In the bleakest of moments, when there's war and famine, disease, falsehood, and disaster, whether on a micro level when nation rises up against nation or micro levels, how many times have you been at war personally with someone? How many times have you had the lack of resources in your life? How many times has someone been false to you, or you have been false to someone else? How many times has disaster struck your family and your circle of friends? So even on the macro level, nation against nation, or on the micro level, on our own personal lives, Jesus asks us to look through the prism of the bleakest of times we're going through to see a future that is filled with promise and hope. To see that hope through a prism of love and courage and faith. For God's promises a future beyond these bleakest times. And God promises that we can live into the promises of God and that we are not meant to get sucked in by the trappings of those other things. Yesterday, French President Francois Hollande said in a press conference, "We will hunt down the people who caused this horror in our city, and we will respond mercilessly." And that is the trapping of terrorism. That when terror strikes us, that we will respond in kind, mercilessly, without regard for others. Wholesale destruction. That is not who we are meant to be as human beings. That is not who we are meant to be as children of God. But it is the trapping of when someone has done something to us. And Jesus says, look through that, fight through that with courage and faith, journey through that. Hold on, little children. Don't you get weary. There's a great day promised in the promised land. Terror, disease, falsehood, disaster, lack of resources, these things have the tendency for us to lose what it means to be children of God. So it doesn't matter how big or indestructible something seems like today. Given a long enough timeline, all things come to an end. So what matters is, what do we do with the time that we are given? What do we do with the time that we are given? There's another story that kind of percolated up to national consciousness this week alongside the terror attack in Paris that touched my heart in a geeky sort of way that might seem very trivial to you but meant so much to me. And when you get right down to it, I think is an example of what truly matters. Daniel Fleetwood was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer at the tender age of 32. He was diagnosed a few years ago with spindle cell carcinoma, which is a rare and aggressive form of cancer that attacks the connective soft tissue in the body. And when doctors, the last time he had a checkup a couple of months ago, when he went to have a checkup, the doctors told him he only had a couple of months to live, and he realized he was going to die before Episode 7 of Star Wars, The Force Awakens, was going to be released. And that just wrecked him. And as someone who has already bought 2 tickets, one on opening night and one for Christmas morning, I understand where Daniel Fleetwood was coming from. But his wife, Ashley, knew that his time was short. And even though it was short, she knew what mattered was what she did with it. And she could not think of a better gift to give her beloved husband than the gift of seeing the movie before he died. And so she started the hashtag Force for Daniel. And on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, it blew up. And it went nationwide, and thousands of people reached out to Disney and Lucasfilm and J.J. Abrams. Even Luke Skywalker himself, Mark Hamill, said, "Show him the movie." And 5 days before he passed away this past week, so about 2 weeks ago, Abrams and Lucasfilm and Disney gave a private showing to Daniel, his wife, and a handful of his friends. Ashley knew that Daniel did not have much time. But she knew what mattered was what she did with the time that he had. Because no one has an infinity. We are all large stones, and eventually we will fade to dust. So what matters is what we do with the time that we're given, and particularly when we're in our bleakest moments. The disciples in the narrative believed they had all the time in the world. That's what they meant by when they looked up and said, "These are such large stones. What large buildings." It was an affirmation of faith and folly. Now, I have to admit, on my very first trip to this church, 3.5 years ago, when Steve and Carolyn Davis took Sasha and I on our initial tour of this campus, when we drove up to this church, I said to myself in the back of my mind, "What a large church! What large buildings!" And I thought to myself, this is a church. Stained glass windows and vaulted ceilings and neon crosses. And I could imagine myself standing here doing this. And I thought, this is it. I've made it. And that is folly. Because the truth is, the stained glass windows and the plaster and the wood and the vaulted ceilings isn't the church. You are. And I am. Someone could come and throw stones through these beautiful windows. This church could burn to the ground. And it would be our bleakest moment. And we'd have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do with it? And I believe that we would respond in the ways that matter, with faith and courage and hope to live in God's future together as church, as a body of people who matter. And we wouldn't regress and live into the worst part of ourselves, but we would respond with the ways that Christ would want us to respond. To look through the war and the famine, the disease and the disaster, and see them as nothing but birth pangs for a new creation about to be born. And that being said, having said that, I don't want our church to burn down. And I don't want our windows to be destroyed. So why wait for us to look at this building and say, what large stones? Instead, let us look above to God and look inside for God and look at each other for God and walk into God's promise with hope and faith and courage today. Because we have been given time. The question is, what are we going to do with it? Amen and amen.